So let's start talking about you, because this is about you. So you've had a very interesting journey. You have been a creative, a creator. You've worked with numerous large-scale companies. Now you're in sort of more of a strategic role with Oakley. Tell us about your journey and how you kind of got here.
So, yeah, I started my journey in New York as a creator. I was a photographer for many years and content creator, and was kind of working at that intersectionality of street culture and fashion and just culture in general, and bringing in I worked with a lot of athletes at that time. And then, after during the digital transformation, I had to pivot into working for an agency because my career collapsed during that time when the music industry and the publishing industry collapsed. So now the last decade, I've been working in integrated marketing and brand management roles for globally matrix brands. And I've worked with Adidas, Converse, Warner Media Network, and now Oakley. And then before that, I worked from the agency side, also on kind of culture, entertainment, strategic initiatives with everyone from Nike to Electronic Arts, Pepsi, and Maserati. So just across different sectors. So yeah, and never thought that I would be sitting in a strategy role, but here I am.
Well, that is a pretty decent resume. So tell us about how the transition of that. Like, I can imagine that, your earlier life as a creative, you probably lived in a lot looser of an environment, and then, having to then work at major corporations and still keep that creative ethos, yet be, a business marketing sort of person.
Yeah, I think, it's definitely a challenge going from being, a free thinker into moving into the corporate environment and having to really understand that what you say and do is highly scrutinized and, understanding, how to operate in a political environment, I guess you could say, and understanding how to move up that ladder as well. And I think what I realized when I first started working, Adidas was the first brand that I worked for, and kind of coming in at the bottom there, I think what I realized was that in order to move up the ladder, food chain, whatever you want to call it, I really had to become more of an operator. And become more strategic and learn how to sell things in, how to build documents, how to create vision and planning and operationalizing all that. So that was kind of where I made, I guess you could say, a commitment to myself to learn those skills. And I think, strategy is, it's not necessarily like a creative direction role per se, but it is highly creative in the sense that you are crafting narratives and vision for companies, and you're also kind of tasked with figuring out how to bring those things to life, and your storytelling essentially. And so I do actually find it to be quite creative. It's definitely not as creative as being on set or working on a photo shoot or on a campaign or something like that. But I think as you move around a corporation and figure out kind of what you want to do with your career, you have to kind of sometimes make trade-offs, right? So.
Cool. So obviously, sports is such a broad topic. With your job, do you cover all aspects of all sports with Oakley?
Yeah, so basically Oakley is a performance-driven brand. So we are part of Luxottica, which owns Ray-Ban, they own Oliver Peoples. They're essentially a licensing business. They do everybody from Armani to Chanel to Dolce & Gabbana glasses, and they're essentially a luxury eyewear company. And Oakley is a performance brand, so we're basically driven by sports marketing, driven by our athlete storytelling, and just through everything is told through the lens of the athlete. And we have a footprint in almost, I would say, any sport that is relevant to culture and our heritage. So obviously we come from an action sports background. Before we made eyewear, we actually, Jim Gennard started with making grips on BMX bikes. That was the first iteration before it became eyewear. And obviously now we make performance apparel, we make helmets, goggles. I mean, if anyone does any kind of sport, you probably know the brand and what they do. But yeah, everything we do is kind of told through the lens of the athlete. And now we're quite heavily invested in building our esports and gaming division too, because that's really where global sports are going in terms of youth culture. So it's kind of a fun, interesting, nascent space that we're exploring.
Very cool. Well, you tapped on one thing, culture. You are a classic cultural marketer. You have quite a reputation in the industry for being such. Tell us a little bit about that and about how the intersection of influencers and athletes, entertainers, how that all kind of comes together in the work that you do.
Yeah, I think cultural marketing is kind of something that's developed over the last decade, really, and I think it was really driven by the digital transformation, where it's like you said, it's kind of a culmination of sports, influencer, and entertainment marketing coming together. It usually has a product proposition attached to it, so there's usually a specific product that's made at the cultural level to drive energy. So it's almost like brands are using the product proposition to integrate themselves and insert themselves into communities in an authentic way. And if there's no product proposition, it's more kind of through the storytelling or through the digital campaign or whatever brand chooses, whichever vehicle they choose to connect to that cultural level. And I think it's really about influencing the influencer. It's about kind of bubbling in or coming into a community, whatever that community might be, depending on what the product is. It's usually something that wants to tap into youth culture. Because that's really where I specialize. So I think not every brand, but a lot of the brands want to reach that consumer when they're very young. So Gen Z, I mean, we're already talking to Gen Alpha at Oakley. Like literally like 10-year-old prodigies and stuff. Like it's crazy. But so you're kind of connecting to that on that cultural level. And then what happens is a lot of times those tactics and that strategy inform a larger overarching mainstream above the line strategy within a company. If you're talking about like big giant multinational companies, right? On a smaller scale, if you're dealing with more startups or companies that are e-commerce, like at Network, for example, I don't consider them a giant company or by any means, but we connected on a cultural level all the time because that was part of leveraging drop culture, the way young people shop, the influencers and the figures within that world that the consumer would respond to. That's what we were leveraging. So essentially, you're leveraging culture to drive energy for a brand. That's really what it is.
Women are actually seeing more success on that side of things. You typically think of college football and college basketball being the male driven, that sort of leading stuff, but the brands are actually gravitating towards female, and it can even be like the biggest one there is a woman named Livy Dunn, who is a gymnast, and she has more following and she gets bigger contracts than anybody in the space. What do you think how would you attribute that?
Well, I think it's interesting, right? Because if you look at the reason why women haven't been represented in these industries or even getting the equal pay that they deserve within the sports, is because it's a multitude of reasons, right? So first off, there hasn't been the media coverage to drive the engagement, right? Now we're seeing more companies investing in women's sports. We're seeing, when you think about women's soccer, when you look at a park, it's all little girls out there playing soccer. So, that's probably the biggest growing sport for young women in the world right now. And I think Megan Rapinoe and a lot of these athletes that have been on the world stage have really done a lot to drive these conversations. I think what's going to happen now is, like I said, social media, women can control and own their own brands, just like any athlete can now. And it's very exciting because, when we work with Team USA, we work with the Olympic Committee, and we had the opportunity to listen to quite a few athletes tell their stories. And a lot of athletes, especially the Paralympic athletes, when they had an accident or were, disabled or whatever happened to them in their lives, they thought that they had no future in sports. And then they realized that they could be a Paralympian and a champion and, use social media to build their brands. And it's just very exciting because it presents a lot of opportunities because there's room for all that. And I think one thing we're saying about sports, men's sports traditionally have, I don't want to say have peaked necessarily, but they're at kind of in their product life cycle, they're kind of at the end. When you think the average baseball fan for MLB is 52 years old, right? So, but women's sports have only one place to go, and that is up and bigger and better. So it's exciting, and I think that's another reason why with esports too, being so globalized and not having language barriers or any kind of other barriers, and a lot of people say it's not even a sport. It's a different type of sport, right? It's a multi-sensory entertainment experience, but if you go to an esports competition or event, it is just like any sporting event. There's just so much energy there and passion in the room and fandom, and so it's very exciting to see what's going to happen and how that's going to disrupt sports, because I think what you're also seeing is these types of organizations partnering with traditional heritage, like the NBA or the WNBA or the MLB, and also that connectivity into Web 3.0, provides that gateway for a lot of those more traditional athletes or organizations to move closer to youth and to be more relevant in the digital space. So multi-pronged approach.
Yeah, and when we're kind of combining these two topics, women seem to be really early adopters and are very involved in the gaming industry. I remember in the beginning it was a very bro-ish sort of thing, but I'm starting to see a lot of women participating, watching it, getting into the social media aspects of it. Are you seeing a lot of that as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's still definitely very male-dominated, but I think, there's less of a barrier to entry. You see a lot of larger organizations developing women's teams. I mean, I know we're chomping at the bits to find female esports athletes, right? So the ones that are out there, the Valkyries and whatnot, those women have the pick of the litter. Whatever they want, they can get. And I mean, same if you're a female-owned brand in the sneaker or streetwear space, you have the pick of the litter. You have every single brand in the world that wants a piece of you, that wants to activate with you, wants to connect to you, because they provide that gateway into those communities and that culture.
So let's shift a little bit and talk about mentorship. Let's talk about what mentorship has been for you as you've come up in the industry, and then also maybe about ways that you've paid it forward now that you're in a senior role.
Yeah, I think mentorship has always been really important to me. I always kind of believe that we're warming the seat for the next generation. That's how I approach it. And also taking that knowledge that maybe more senior leaders in an organization have and sharing that with younger folks. So I think for me, I realized very early on, being an athlete myself, coming from that and having sort of a coaching leadership, it was very important for me to open the door for other people, maybe people that didn't have as many opportunities, that maybe didn't come from a traditional background of, getting a master's degree or whatever, some fancy university or whatever it was, and just being more open to understanding that pipeline within an organization and even recruiting people from outside traditional spaces. So I think as diversity and inclusion becomes more important and representation becomes more important within companies, it's important to look in other places for these folks, right? I know, Nike and Adidas, Converse, we actually used our retail doors as a pipeline for a lot of these young folks, right? Coming in who maybe don't even have a college education, but they have definitive skills that can benefit the organization, and they're really connected to communities. So, I believe that diverse teams outperform homogenous ones. So I think mentorship is important for that. I take a lot of time with people, sometimes people that don't work for me too, people that hit me up on LinkedIn or that I meet socially or through organizations. If they're engaged and they want the advice and mentorship, I'm happy to give it. If it's a good fit, obviously, the personality depends as well. But I think it's important because you get a lot from mentorship as well, right? It's not just a one way; it's a give and take, and so I think it's a very fulfilling part of being a leader.
Yeah. And let's also talk about diversity a little bit more. So, obviously in recent years, this has become an absolute requisite with companies. And it's on two sides. It's one, both inner company, and then also the way that a company shows itself to be that. In your experience with Oakley in specific, is there anything that you would point to or previous experiences that you've had that were particularly poignant to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about working for big companies, right, is it's like the Titanic, right? It takes them forever to shift and make a move, and they talk about it, but it takes years to actually do it. And I think a lot of them were kind of forced into it, frankly. I mean, I don't know if anybody remembers, there was a lot of stuff on social media, calling out people at Nike, calling out people at Adidas, people, heads were rolling because things were said and things weren't appropriate and whatnot. But I think, a lot of these companies realized they had to make a commitment to it, and they really had to start, pumping up the pipeline, figuring out how they were going to bring more women and people of color into senior leadership positions, things of that nature. And I think, it starts from within, obviously. There's a lot of talk about culture in companies. That's very important, of them walking the walk as well as talking the talk. And then, I know for us at Oakley, one thing that's really important is we need to be at the forefront of making sure that our sports roster is diversified and representative of culture, especially as a global company. We want to make sure that we have, athletes in APAC that are representing those regions, athletes in LATAM that are representing those regions, making sure that we have enough women on our roster. And we've had amazing success with our, each year we have better and better and better numbers, and I think some of the challenges are some of those sports that have very high barriers to entry, maybe surf, snowboarding, sports that typically are, one thing or another. That's definitely a challenge, but I think even those industries and those industry organizations realize that if they don't diversify those sports, they will not survive. So I think everybody's starting to realize how important that is. And I think it's also making sure that as a company, we support the brand ambassadors and the athletes out there that are leading the charge with the consumer, through their tone of voice and their authentic content and channels and platform, to make sure that we support them so that they can do part of that work with us.
So I guess we did a really good job of dovetailing everything, because within diversity, you surprised me yesterday when I asked you, let's talk about charity, what charities mean something to you. And you said to me, Buy from a Black Woman, an Atlanta-based female entrepreneurs organization. How did you come to know this organization, and tell us a little bit about your work with them?
So I remember when Jeff Bezos' wife was making all those big donations, right? And it was a lot of press. And I said, what can I do to support an organization, within my skill set? And I did a bunch of research, and that organization came up. And I had reached out to a few other organizations, but I had a real rapport with the woman that ran that organization. She's a veteran and, single mom. And I started working with them I teach them strategy, brand management classes, and I also help them providing templates and advice. And it's been an amazing experience. The women come from all different types. They have all different types of businesses. I mean, one woman had an amazing tea company. Another one made products for graduation. It's really diverse businesses, and they were so engaging and so talented, and I actually learned quite a bit from them too. So it was really an amazing experience working with them, and I want to do more of that work too, just with them and other charities, just to support and give back a little bit.
Love it. All right, well, we only have a couple more minutes left. Are there any questions from the audience? Come on, somebody wants to ask.
We covered it all.
Any questions? Yeah. There you Hi, I'm Julianne Katz. I'm with Anheuser-Busch. Something that's on our minds a lot as we're partnering with athletes, entertainers, content creators of all kinds is that, yes, social media is an amazing way for these talents to own their brand and develop in exciting ways that they maybe weren't able to 20 years ago, 10 years ago. But it also opens the door for a lot more risk. So many things can go wrong when you kind of lack that control from a brand side. So what are some ways that you guys are kind of mitigating risk or trying to, at least to, control the situation a little?
Great question. There's a scandal every day, right?
Every day.
Yeah, I mean, we recently had a situation where we had one of our esports teams, one of the leaders there made some comments that he was supporting somebody that didn't match our values or vision, right? And it was right around the time that we were going to announce the partnership, so that caused a lot of issues. I think that's still being worked out. But I would say, given my experience, at Converse and Adidas, working in entertainment marketing, I think contractually you have to be very clear as to what constitutes egregious behavior. I think you have to have a very strong vetting criteria as well. You work in influencer marketing too. I think just understanding who you're partnering with and understanding their brand and making sure that as brand ambassadors you choose wisely. But making sure that contract is also in place if you have to sever ties for whatever reason. I think like anything, when you have a celebrity in your campaign, right? I mean, it could come out that they did something terrible, So it's always kind of been a risk in a way, but obviously with social media, the risk is greater and you have a lot more people to deal with and worry about. So I just think, making sure you have like a really good contract, making sure that they understand the brand values and what is appropriate behavior, that kind of thing. But it's definitely a challenge.
And if I'm giving a shameless plug to Influential, which I should, I realized I didn't even introduce myself or anything. This is how selfless I am. But anyway, so I'll go ahead and do that now. So Influential is the world's biggest influencer marketing platform. And the reason I bring that to light right now is because there are platforms like mine that actually do that work for you so that you can't control the future. If they go and get a DUI after you sign them, I can't help you there. But we can go back into the entire history of all of the things they've done on social, even things that they've erased, and we can always vet for those sorts of things. And platforms like ours also do full background checks. You could know if they had a DUI all the way down to a parking ticket. So there are a lot of ways that you can defense against that.
We work with you.
Say no more.
You're already a client.
Any other questions?
Come on, who wants the plushie? Here we go.
Hi there. My name's TJ with TikTok. As you're looking at getting into the gaming space, it's so many players, both literally and figuratively, publishers and creators and esports, and a lot of brands don't know really where to start. How do you look at that landscape and figure out, okay, this is a new space we're getting into, this makes the most sense? Then how do you see Oakley showing up in the next few years, kind of continuing to invest in that space?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is, esports and gaming and content creation is very intertwined, right? So the way we sort of have segmented it is we see esports as kind of like our podium, contracted athletes. And then within the gaming space, we work with content creators that are gamers. Also, a lot of times we'll have our, not yet, it hasn't happened, but some of our esports athletes will retire from esports and move into streaming and working on Twitch or TikTok or controlling their YouTube channels and whatnot, because that's how they make so much money and continue to have their followings. So it's definitely a very different space than traditional sports in that sense, because most sports marketing departments wouldn't work with content creators or people that aren't in actual competition. But we do within our space because we feel like esports and gaming is so different than any of the other other sort of influencers we work with, and our teams, the way that we have it divided, and different brands divided differently, right? Some companies have an entertainment division that handles influencers. Some companies have PR that handles that. So it really depends on the company and the knowledge of the teams that are managing those influencers and verticals. Depending on what it is. I think we actually just launched our TikTok at Oakley probably about 5 or 6 months ago. So that's been very successful for us, and we're really excited about that. But just having that kind of like, how are we going to do Twitch? How are we as a brand, like how do we show up where the consumer is when we don't necessarily have that infrastructure? Is definitely provides a lot of challenges.
Well, I think we're out of time. If there's one more question, we can take that. Otherwise, we'll bid adieu.
Any other questions? Okay.
Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Reggie. Great insights as always.